for once, I remember Douglas.
Good job, Tim.
Thank you. All right. We still got people filtering in, so let's give this another minute if that's okay. Lovely to see you all.
You look like you have a bit of a smile on your face today.
I don't know why. It's the second week of the quarter, and my little juniors, as we might call them, are still finding their way. So I have been very busy all week answering emails with questions that should have been obvious, but that's okay. It's a learning process for all of us. So. All right, I think we will get started. So I'm going to bring up my trusty PowerPoint here and share that with you. That looks like the right one. There we go. All right. Well, welcome everyone. If we get more people, we'll let them in as we go. Otherwise, I'm so very glad to be back with you again to talk about this time, the election we just had and what all the fallout seems to be. Obviously, it's a time of great change. The new president is already busy at work trying to change things to the way he thinks they ought to be. And so if nothing else, it's sort of interesting to watch. And we'll talk about what he might be working on, and then also the kinds of challenges that he might face. And we'll talk a little about some other things in general. So as you no doubt know, last week we had this, which finally prompted some Republicans who had stuck with Mr. Trump all along to repudiate him. There was simply no evidence, as in zero evidence, that there was any appreciable election fraud. The election was as fair a one as we've probably ever had. There wasn't even the outside interference that we had in 2016. But in any case, couple thousand people stormed the Capitol in a vain attempt to keep Congress from confirming President Biden's victory in the election. So 5 people died. Sometimes I see 6 and sometimes I see 5, so I'm sticking with 5. But in any case, it was interesting. 5 Seattle police officers were apparently there, and the city said today that if they find they participated in this, they will be fired, and that their names will be turned over to the FBI. President Trump, clearly in a speech that day, incited people to go to the Capitol. I mean, that's my take. You may disagree, but that seems evident that he was simply not willing to live with the election results. 60 different lawsuits were tossed out for lack of evidence. Many of those judges were Trump appointees, so there really shouldn't be any doubt that this was in fact a free and fair election. So this is probably my favorite / least favorite picture from the assault on the Capitol. If you say you're a patriot, you don't go around carrying a Confederate flag. I'm sorry. That's sedition. That's overthrowing the government by other than democratic means. So let's look at what actually happened here with the election, the presidency. We have a new president. It's a little slow today. Sorry about that. Here are the numbers. So I always find it interesting that this is considered a solid victory, and most elections tend to look like this. Slightly less than half the country votes for somebody other than the winner, although it is worth noting that in something like the last 32 years, the Republican candidate has actually won the popular vote once. So it's as we'll talk about next time, the Electoral College is facing sort of increasing challenges in terms of whether this is a fair way to elect presidents or not. But
No.
this is sort of hardly a landslide victory. The previous president enjoyed still quite a bit of support. It's a curious thing as to why that would happen, but in any case, he obviously held some appeal for a number of people. Any way you measure it, however, he lost. The electoral vote tends to sort of magnify the popular vote. It's sort of like the Dow Jones Industrial Averages. Apparently, a 1 point change in any of the Dow stocks moves the Dow average about 4 points. So the Electoral College is much the same way. If we look at the Electoral College results, we see that Biden carried the states that we would expect him to, but he also carried Arizona, typically a red state. He also carried Georgia, long a red state. He reclaimed some states lost by Hillary Clinton 4 years ago. The little numbers here for Nebraska and Maine, it's worth noting that they apportion a part of their electoral votes by congressional district. So it's possible for them to have a split state. So while Biden won overall, there was a congressional district in Maine that went for Trump. So he got a vote there, and same thing in Nebraska. Trump won the state overall, but one of the congressional districts went for Biden. So we have a new president. He is 78, the oldest president we have ever elected. He ran several times before. 1988, he might very well have been the Democrat nominee, but he has the knack of sort of saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. It is one of the things that he will have to struggle against. He had portions of a speech that apparently came from a speech by a Labour Party leader in the UK, and so in essence, whether he meant to or not, he had plagiarized part of this speech, and then his campaign sort of unraveled, which was not good for the Democrats because the guy they ended up with, Michael Dukakis, was not a strong candidate. So I have to take a dog timeout, so I will be right back if you will hold with me. Sorry.
Well, isn't it right? Got it on mute.
All right. So, meanwhile, the outgoing president left yesterday, becoming the first president in something like 152 years to not be at his successor's inauguration. I think that's just as well. He apparently wanted a big military send off, and the Pentagon simply said, no, we're not going to do that. So he has gone off to Florida. He promises he will be back. He could still be convicted in a trial by the Senate, having been impeached again by the House. He apparently owes a lot of people a lot of money and has lost a lot of business. I think really the thing that did the trick again was his performance in and around the assault on the Capitol. So at long last, he went really too far. So Congress, we had elections. Now, it's an interesting election year, I think, simply because even though the Republicans lost the presidency, they did better in Congress. And I'm not exactly sure why that is compared to the 2018 elections when the Democrats took back control of the House and made gains in the Senate. There seemed to be less of a sense of urgency for whatever reason among the Democrat campaigners. So I think the other thing that happened is that it was an election about which a lot of people cared deeply, and so people showed up. People showed up to vote, Republicans, Democrats, and independents alike, and so that probably served to help boost some Republican candidates for Congress. If we look at the House of Representatives, it looks pretty much like every map I've ever shown you. So, but what the country looks like politically, the dark red spaces are where Republicans picked up House seats, and they picked up a few. The Democrat majority in the House is now smaller than it was 2 weeks ago. So that poses some challenges for them. There's a few dark blue spots here. That's where Democrats were able to pick up some seats. So there were some changes there. In our own state, as we have probably already noted, there were basically no changes. Republicans did no better in Democrat districts and vice versa. So our congressional delegation looks essentially the same. Interesting to note that only one Washington State Representative, Republican Kathy McMorris Rogers, essentially refused to condemn the president for his role in the assault on the Capitol. She's from the Spokane area and won in 2018 against a very strong candidate and won this time against a much weaker candidate. So she'll probably be there as long as she wants to. So, but two others, Dan Newhouse and Jamie Herrera Butler, both voted against the president in the impeachment trial. So that's quite a break for regular Republicans like that to take that step. If we look at let's see if that comes up. We look at the House here, you can see the Democrats went from 235 seats to 232. The Republicans went from 197 seats to 212. So they made some gains there. It will affect things on the margin. The House, it's easier to push legislation through. Much bigger deal in the Senate, how close your majority is. Continuing a decades-long trend, if we just totaled up all the congressional votes across the country, the Democrats continue to overall poll more votes than the Republicans do. And that's because of gerrymandering, which we have talked before. State legislatures, when they are in charge of redistricting, they tend to draw districts that favor one party over the other. Republicans have controlled a number of state legislatures across the country where they've clearly done that. You try to pack, say, as many Democrats into as few districts as possible so that they have less chance, and you make sort of more solidly Republican districts. So the Senate, these are simply the states that where Senate races were up, and the Republicans picked up a seat in Alabama. They elected former Auburn football coach Tommy Tuberville, who didn't say much during the campaign, which, based on what he said since then, is probably a good thing. He said, among other things, he said, well, I'm pretty sure we fought a war in Europe to defeat socialism. Well, we didn't. He was probably confusing that with National Socialism, which was, of course, the Nazi party and really had nothing to do with socialism. They just called it that. So, but Senator Tuberville is now in office. The Democrats picked up seats in Arizona and Colorado. We thought they might, Susan Collins might lose in Maine, but she managed to hang on. The Democrats picked up 2 seats in Georgia, and this is what has tipped the balance of power in the Senate. Those were the last elections to get counted. The Republicans ran very strange campaigns. You had Republican people saying, well, this election's going to be fixed, don't vote, which is not going to increase your turnout. President Trump visited the state. I gather that didn't actually help. And in any case, a woman named Stacey Abrams, who was House Minority Leader in the Georgia State Assembly and very nearly became the governor of Georgia in 2016, sort of led the Democrat efforts in Georgia, managed to get out the vote and picked up those 2 Senate seats. So that produced a 50-50 tie in the legislature, and because the vice president is a Democrat and the vice president votes to break ties, can be the presiding officer of the Senate, that means that the Democrats, in a very small sense, control the Senate. So we'll come back to that in a moment. Here we can look at the numbers. Mitch McConnell goes from majority to minority leader, and Chuck Schumer goes from minority to majority leader. And the parties generally meet after elections to elect new leadership, but at this point, I don't gather there's any hankering. There are no challenges to the power of either of these 2 gentlemen. They are apparently meeting to sort of try to come up with some kind of power sharing arrangement so that committees will not be heavily balanced one way or another. So it'll be interesting to see. This is one of the variables that will determine what really happens in a Biden presidency. Is Mr. McConnell now willing to actually try to get things done, or will he stonewall as he did during the last 6 years of the Obama administration? So we'll see what happens with that. Bring up this next slide. Sorry, this is so slow. So here we see. So the Democrats actually only have 48 members, but caucusing with them are 2 independents, Bernie Sanders of Vermont and Angus King of Maine. Given those gentlemen's politics, they're extremely unlikely to sit with the Republicans. So that's what gives the Democrats 50 votes. Having such a tiny majority, makes it much harder for anybody to get anything done. In any case, the Senate rules are such that one senator can block almost anything, right? They can call for a point of privilege. You can hang up somebody's nominee. They can threaten to filibuster. Filibuster means that somebody gets up and they speak and they refuse to yield the floor. Now, during debates way back in the 60s over civil rights legislation, that actually happened. Southern Democrats were putting cots in the hallways so that people could nap while they took their turn to keep the debate going and keep votes from happening on civil rights legislation. Now all you have to do is threaten a filibuster, and that means that let's see here. One of you needs to be muted. There are a couple ways around this. So there's the so-called nuclear option. The Senate makes its own rules, and you could get rid of the filibuster. And the idea here, of course, is that the filibuster prevents bad legislation from happening. Of late, it's meant that it prevents any legislation from happening. So basically, you need 60 votes to get something through the Senate. And the question remains, well, will the Democrats and independents all stick together? And are there 10 votes to be had in the Republican caucus? I don't know. The other thing that they can do is called a budget reconciliation. And by that maneuver, they can pass something with a 1-vote majority. So we may expect to see a little bit more of that. So this is the world that President Biden faces. So going forward, let's see. There are a number of things that the president says he has to work on, and they're all, I think, fairly obvious. First of these being the economy. He has talked about he has talked about the stimulus package, right, to sort of boost consumption and keep people from losing their homes or starving to death. Um, we may see at least an effort to rescind some of the Trump tax cuts, which largely went to the wealthiest Americans. Every year or so, research comes out that shows that tax cuts simply don't stimulate the economy, and certainly the wealth doesn't trickle down. I mean, this is one of those things that sometimes my younger students are like, well, yeah, but that's my opinion. It's like, it doesn't matter. These are the facts. This thing just does not work. So that may be something he's sort of hinting towards: more spending on research and development and more investment in so-called green jobs to sort of put people to work. And then also finally infrastructure, since we do have a nation of crumbling roads and bridges, and that, if nothing else from a safety angle, needs to happen. I still argue, really, in the long term, the issue of the century, the environment and climate change. Biden seems to be committed to doing something about this. And yesterday, in his 17 executive orders on day one after the inauguration, one of them was to rejoin the Paris Climate Accords. Now, believe I've told you before, I'm not sure we're going about this in the right way, but at least taking it seriously would seem to be a step forward. Here's today's depressing graphic: temperature change in the last 50 years. Now, a 4-degree temperature change, the bright red there at the top of the graphic, might not seem to be much, but that would melt the polar ice caps and all of the frozen carbon underneath it, which would greatly increase the temperature of the planet and make vast portions of it largely unlivable. So that's an issue that he hopes to take up. I don't think taxing carbon emitters is probably the right answer, because that's only going to produce political resistance. My thought has been for years, look, pay people to stop doing things you don't want them to do. That's going to be maybe more expensive up front, but cheaper in the long run. Another big issue that the president faces is, of course, immigration. You may remember this photo from the era of separating children from their families as they attempted to cross the border. Now, what we do about immigration is certainly an important issue, but in any case, under a Biden administration, we will no longer be locking up children in cages, which really, really, really happened. So as I was researching this photo, it was a famous shot. Turns out that the young girl was not separated from her mother, and nobody's quite sure what happened to them. But in any case, the fear, of course, is that there will now be caravans of immigrants coming north, and there's some evidence of that. But Biden also said that he's going to get rid of this stay in Mexico order that had happened under the Trump administration. So the big short-term issue, of course, is COVID, which is, by gosh, we're number one. Are you tired of all the winning yet? 400,000 deaths now, millions of cases, even healthy people who get it frequently. I saw a report recently that said the college athletes who got COVID, so these are like young, strong, healthy people, 20% of them suffered permanent lung damage. So and the other thing that occurred to me the other day, I thought, early on people were saying, oh, this is no worse than the flu. I've never actually met anyone who died from the flu. I'm not saying that didn't happen, but the third thing is that it flu numbers are way down this year, and that appears to have something to do with people taking more care and wearing masks. So, and there's increasing evidence that wearing a mask also decreases your chance of getting COVID. Biden has vowed to get 100 million people inoculated with the coronavirus serum. It's a laudable goal. Washington State is like 4th best in the country for controlling the coronavirus. So despite people castigating Governor Inslee for trying to clamp down on this, it appears to have actually worked. So I tend to think that's a good thing. Now, Here's another issue that the president must deal with is foreign policy. This is when he was vice president. He's walking there with the ever scowling Xi Jinping, president of China, and the rest of the world, except maybe the Chinese and the Russians. In fact, I think actually, from what I've read, the Chinese are relieved too. Will probably find it easier to deal with the Biden administration. That being said, there are a lot of fences to mend and bridges to rebuild. And, you know, the number of issues on the foreign policy plate are really quite substantial. So you've got to do something about confronting China. Their trade policies are not exactly fair. President Trump was right about that, but what he did didn't seem to have helped. We simply lost agricultural sales to Russia. We've also got Iran to deal with, and the Middle East, and Afghanistan, and our allies in Europe. And so there's a lot to take care of there. So the president is facing just all kinds of issues. He issued 17 executive orders yesterday aimed at starting to change things around from what the direction that President Trump was heading. He fired 3 people who were Trump appointees in various federal agencies. I think my favorite tidbit about that was the guy that they'd appointed to take over the sort of the government communications program, which includes Voice of America. And by law, those things are not supposed to be politicized. They're just supposed to be straight up news organizations that share our news around the world. And this guy fired a bunch of people and clamped down on people who were still trying to report. And then the president said, you need to quit. And he didn't. So the president fired him. And he tweeted, he said, well, if this office is going to be politicized, you know, that's just wrong. He apparently missed the apparent irony in that statement, but there we go. Legislatively speaking, on the plus side, Biden has experience in the U.S. Senate, a lot of experience, and he was an effective legislator. He wasn't always behind legislation that we might now consider to be good, and he said as much, particularly with regard to things like sort of 3 strikes, you're out kind of legislation, which hasn't worked at all. He has a knack for saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. On the other hand, he will admit it when he's messed up, which is sort of more often than you might like. So he has the chance to get some things done. Unlike President Obama, great speaker, first-rate guy, kind of an average president because he really didn't have that much experience. And quite frankly, as I've said before, utterly squandered his chance to kind of rearrange the political map in America by not concentrating enough on economic recovery. I think Biden will have a better sense of that. On the other hand, his recovery package has a 1.9 trillion price tag, which tends to make a number of people in Congress get a bit nervous. How are we going to pay for that, et cetera? And of course, because there is a Democrat in the White House, you should all note deficits matter again. Right? Republican deficits don't matter. Democrat deficits are always a dagger poised at the heart of the body of the nation. So we will soon begin to hear on Fox News about how awful and irresponsible this is. Even though historically Republican presidents tend to run up bigger deficits than Democrat ones do. Again, a fact. So there we are. Now, if we turn our sights a little closer to home, the Washington State Legislature is in session, and their task is getting a little bit easier. And the reason for that is that state revenue collections keep creeping upward, which means that there won't be as much to cut out of the budget as might have appeared even 9 months ago. So if you're, yeah, all right. So it's, the task at hand is in some way similar to what Congress and the president face. We've got COVID to deal with. We have we have the economy to sort of jumpstart. We certainly have, like the rest of the country, lost a lot of jobs in tourism. I'm going to find which one of you needs to be muted, because when I can hear myself coming back through your thing, that's at least distracting to me. So, you've got restaurateurs clamoring to open, saying it's very difficult for them to sort of continue in business when they basically can't sell any food. Certainly some restaurants around here have simply said, well, we're going to close up shop till this is over. Just doing takeout and the occasional outside dining. I mean, that doesn't sound like fun, does it? Outside dining in January when it's 40 degrees and raining, that's, somebody asked me if I wanted to go dine outside. I'm like, no, I really don't want to do that. So, all right, we will get a redistricting commission this year. And in Washington, it's a bit different than it is in the rest of the country. We're one of the relative handful of states that has a redistricting commission. So it is not an utterly partisan exercise. It's not nonpartisan. Each of the four caucuses, Republicans and Democrats in the state house and Senate, appoint somebody. So there's four people there, and they elect a non-voting chairperson. And between them, they will look at all the census data. And by 2022, we will get new legislative and congressional districts. The boundaries will change. Here's what's likely to happen. And this sort of exacerbates some of the problems that we face. Those districts there to the right on that graphic on the east side of the state are only going to get bigger, because the population keeps growing in central Puget Sound, and the population is not growing anywhere near as fast in eastern Washington. So if we look down there in the far right corner, if you could mute yourselves, that would really help. Garfield County. Garfield County has like less than 3,000 people in it. And so District 9, which includes Walla Walla, which is a city of some size, but these other districts, also Whitman County, is only likely to get bigger. I mean, the 7th district, Okanagan, Ferry, Stevens, and Pend Oreille County, plus parts of Spokane, a huge district. I mean, it would be very difficult to represent that district because the towns are small and scattered far apart, and they're not all on the freeway. So on the other hand, central Puget Sound, our districts will get, geographically speaking, even smaller. The districts have to be within 1% of each other in terms of population. So the redistricting commission will do that. The criticism that they get is not that they draw the districts for partisan advantage, but that they sometimes sort of protect incumbents too much, because the four members of the committee plus the chair, the four members of the committee are members of the legislature. They're understandably thinking about, well, who are our friends here? And you know, they're not going to go out of their way to hurt those folks. So we don't have too many districts, really. I mean, if you just look at this map, none of them are sort of too wildly drawn like they are in some states. But it exacerbates the east-west divide. And I think one of the concerns that we should have in the state going forward is that we do listen to the people out in the rural areas. I mean, granted, there aren't as many of them, but they're still citizens and important. And since agriculture, if nothing else, is still one of our state's biggest and most important industries, we have to think about that stuff. I had one Eastern Washington Republican legislator tell me that last session he heard a Democrat from the West Side say that farmers don't pay taxes. Well, that's absolutely absurd. Of course they do. So, so for our state, we will, I think, as usual, muddle along. We have that cascade curtain divide to be concerned about. I think we will get through coronavirus, of course, and as the state's revenue picture improves, now we have begun. This is what we do in Washington. We study things. And so we have now launched what will probably be at least a 4-year study of the state's tax system, which is actually one of the worst in the country for all kinds of reasons. If we simply adopted Idaho's tax system, right? And Idaho is hardly a hotbed of liberalism. If we adopted Idaho's tax system, we would collect $8 to $10 billion more a year in taxes. Now, of course, that means all of us would be paying some of that, but the bottom line is that the state would have enough money to do the kinds of things that people generally say they want the state to do. Probably fix more roads. We probably make tuition affordable. We probably have smaller class sizes. We have any number of things we could do with that. And in any case, with that kind of money, we wouldn't have to make other increases in taxes. The one tax that will rear its head again, of course, is a capital gains tax, which is a tax on the sale of assets such as stocks and bonds. Most states have this tax. We're one of the few that doesn't. Conservatives and Republicans necessarily are against this. And the thing that I still hear and first heard when I first went to work at the legislature way back when is that, if you pass any kind of income tax, the next step is that the state will come and simply perform a total cashectomy and take all of your money. I don't know that that's a given, but it is a concern for many people. So a difficult issue. We will study it to death until the point at which we have to do something. At least that's my prediction. It's usually what we do. So all right, I have babbled at you for a bit, and I'm going to be amazed if you don't have some questions. So now please go ahead and ask. I'll try to say something coherent. Dave. And now you're going to want to unmute yourselves if you're going to ask a question. So, and I will try to remember to repeat the question.
Now can you hear me?
I can hear you now, sir.
Okay. I have no idea what switch that is.
It's okay.
I've tried to be objective listening to the different news media, but I can't stay on too long, some of these. Yesterday, I heard one news anchor person trying to ask questions of their counsel about the cost of canceling Keystone, the pipeline. And what I want to do is I want to ask the cost of added security that we could have ignored if Trump would have just simply said, calm down, boys, we're not going to do anything now, or something.
Yeah. I mean, now that to me is an issue about which reasonable people can't disagree. Unlike some other things where it's just like, no, there are facts here. In that case, I mean, we have a number of things to consider, and you're quite right. If you build the thing, there will be high security costs, and some people are in effect violently against it. Well, there's the question of running over Native American land, which is, I think, not to be ignored. We sign treaties with these folks, and it's just immoral, if nothing else, to ignore those treaties. There is, for many people, the concern about sort of keeping the oil industry going, since burning carbon-based fuels is, one of the chief sources of greenhouse gases. There's also the question of, does this help us continue to be energy independent? I mean, that's no small consideration. So there's a number of things at stake here, and whatever happens with Keystone, certainly there will be people who are able to make rational arguments about why that's a good decision or a bad one.
Well, Canada definitely wanted it for their development of their industry.
Which is certainly sort of ironic, given that Canada tends to have sort of a more eco-friendly approach to the world than we do. Now here's another thing, that oil from the tar sands in Calgary is apparently some of the most expensive, least efficient fuel on Earth, because it takes so much energy just to separate the oil from the tar sands. They have to literally put it in a giant centrifuge and spin it so that it takes almost as much energy to get that oil to produce energy as you actually get from the oil. So there's an economic argument to be made for saying, this isn't actually a good decision. On the other hand, the advantage of oil and coal is that they're very energy dense. I mean, they're really great fuels. Other than the byproducts that they produce, there's a reason we use so much of those, which speaks to why you can still actually make a dime from spending all that energy to produce a gallon of oil from Alberta. So that's a great question, Dave, and I don't really have a good answer, but I think it's an interesting point. The
Well, it's a
security
multiplying
costs.
factor also when you have 50 states. So he could have softened the blow to regionally by just saying, stay back.
Yeah, yeah, oh, yeah, yeah. I'm not wildly in favor of it, but I do like to make the point that, well, there are at least rational arguments on both sides of that. So, other questions? Other questions? Your quiet group today, did they not give you lunch today? Were you not fed?
Yes, Tim.
Joe.
The same kind of question concerning Alaska and the oil. Is there who's got the right answer there?
Well, in the case of Alaska, certainly you've got on the one hand people who say, look, this is the last wilderness. We should not just trash this over. I do understand that among President Biden's orders was to rescind a number of permits for doing just that. Alaska's a funny state. They're sort of well, we want the federal government to leave us alone, but on the other hand, the federal government, the rest of the country, aside from oil, basically subsidizes the whole state. I mean, they get way more in federal aid than they actually pay in taxes. It's a big, beautiful state, and I can understand their frustrations. One, oil is the thing that they have in most abundance. Two, there's so much federal land up there that it's difficult for development to happen under the best of circumstances. So once again, you've got arguments on either side that are not without logic about why we should take one task or another. In Biden's case, in both of those things, he's likely to just continue to say no to those things, simply because the people who elected him, by and large, would agree with those positions. So it's not going to be like President Trump saying yes. It's going to be President Biden continuing to say no, and people will continue to argue about why that's a good idea or a bad idea. I mean, there's no clear-cut answer there, and people may disagree. People who are concerned about the environment would certainly say, "Oh, yes, there is. We shouldn't be burning more oil." And there again, I think well, if we're really serious about not burning more oil, then we probably need to pay industry to convert to a hydrogen-based economy, which would be much cleaner, easier to get to. But the idea of giving people money to do something that they should morally do anyway doesn't always get widespread support from the left. So I'm just like, okay, what's politically possible here? Let's do that. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So other questions? Yes, Suzanne. You'll have to unmute. There you go. Still can't hear you. All right, you're not muted, so you might check and see if your microphone is on. You turn up the volume on that, perhaps? Yeah, okay, all right. Other questions? Other
I
questions?
got another one.
Sure, Joe.
Does anybody have a handle, local people, Northwest people, anybody have a handle on how we would change our tax system to something more progressive?
In Washington State?
Yes.
Well, yeah, it wouldn't be hard to do. A guy named Dick Conway, who's a local economist of recent vintage and excellent reputation, studied this just a few years ago, and he pointed out that the growth rates between Washington and Oregon were not different, despite us having very different tax systems. So having a sales tax or not having a sales tax, or having an income tax or not having an income tax, apparently doesn't make much difference as to economic growth. So if you wanted a more fair, stable tax system in Washington State, well, you got to have an income tax of some kind. One of the problems that we have now is that despite substantial economic growth in our state over the last few decades, tax collections do not match that. They trail that. So that even though the state's getting richer, the government's not collecting more money, and there are enough things that people say they want, that, well, you do have to collect some taxes. Taxes, as Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, taxes are the price of civilization. Nobody likes to pay them. Americans have never liked paying them, and this goes all the way back to the Revolution, obviously. But they're a necessary evil. So I always find it interesting that the people who complain the most about taxes are the wealthiest people. And I just frequently want to say, so what about this is not working for you? You became filthy, stinking rich, and you're complaining that you have to pay too much in tax. But an income tax would stabilize that. It should be possible to write it in a way that it neither needlessly penalizes anyone or under taxes people who might pay their fair share. So I'm not in favor of high marginal tax rates. Ronald Reagan's tax cuts utterly failed to fix the deficit, you may recall, just made it bigger. On the other hand, a tax rate of over 50%, even at the top tax bracket, seems like confiscation to me, and that sends the wrong message to people. So a relatively low tax rate with some generous deductions for certain kinds of things would address this, because what our reliance on the sales tax means that, and we took it off of food and medicine, which was the right thing to do because that really hurt low income people. But so the stuff that's left, cars and homes and all the things that go into houses and clothing, are the things that people stop buying in a recession. So every time we have a recession, tax collections fall. The state has less money precisely at the moment at which people need higher levels of government service because they're out of work. So adding that to the mix and then reducing perhaps the sales tax and the property tax commensurate. So you could conceivably do this in a revenue neutral way, but simply make tax collections a little more consistent. And that would make governing the state a little bit easier, I think. Capital gains tax is popular in some circles simply because most people will never pay that. Right. It is only the wealthiest people, those fortunate enough to have enough money and smart enough to buy stocks and then sell them. Right. Those are the people who get stuck paying that tax. So it's something like less than 3% of the people in Washington state would ever pay a capital gains tax. Well, of course, that makes it not very popular with the wealthiest people in the state. So there's always that political challenge there because they have the resources to campaign against this, saying this will destroy America. So it's not an intractable problem. It's just basically finding enough votes to make that happen. And if we did that, of course, there would be a referendum and it would be forced onto the ballot. And then there would be yet another god awful campaign about how this is the first step towards Marxism, socialism, and communism, and, pick your ism there. Taxes will lead us down the path of doom. I hope you know that I don't agree with that statement, but you guys are smart and you listen. My younger students, if I said that to them, they would answer, he said that taxes would lead us down the path of doom. So, other questions?
Taxes on services.
Ray, say that again, please.
I'm concerned about the taxes on services.
The B&O tax?
Yeah.
Yeah, that is the strangest tax anywhere, right? I mean, it's a tax on gross receipts. And if your business makes less than $50,000 a year, which admittedly is really not very much, you don't pay the tax, but everybody else does. It's there basically because it's better for the Boeings and the Weyerhaeusers, who are concerned that if there was a corporate profit tax, they could actually pay more. And there are apparently so many different little things written into the B&O tax law that there's no lack of people who would argue that changing it would be, wreak some terrible evil on the country. So, yeah, I don't understand this tax at all, but it's one that we have, and of all of them, I would say that's the one least likely to go away soon, even though there does, to my mind, something wrong with charging people a tax on their sales in a year in which they maybe didn't make any profit. So, yeah, that's yet another example of Washington's kind of clown car tax system. So,
another question.
Sure.
How do you think the government's supposed to pay for the stimulus money, especially when we get more?
Okay, so that's not an intractable problem, I think. Federal government, not always, but obviously regularly engages in what's called deficit spending, which basically means spending more money than they're collecting in tax revenues. If we go way back, President Clinton handed off to the second President Bush a balanced budget, and he proceeded to, through the wars and through, I would argue, again, unnecessary tax cuts, turn that into a deficit. Well, we fund the deficit by borrowing. And the way that works is that the Treasury Department auctions off government securities, bonds, T-bills, T-notes, to a consortium of the country's largest banks. That's who buys them. They turn around and sell them on the open market. And that's how foreign countries end up with so much of our debt. That's not a new thing or a terrible, I don't think that's anything to be concerned about. As I make my students repeat out loud, we do not borrow money from China. China just ends up with more dollars than what they need. They know what to do with, so they park them in U.S. Treasury securities. Relatively safe investment, and it pays a little interest. More than half of our debt is held by foreign investors. So at this point, with continued very, very low interest rates, there probably isn't a better time to go out and borrow more money. If you also then sort of ease back the Trump era tax cuts, you can probably afford the 1.9 trillion. You just have to get over the fact that a Democrat deficit is no worse than a Republican deficit, which is an eternal challenge in this country. So, so that's not impossible to do, but I think there's already, sort of resistance in Congress. If I was to bet, I would say we will get another stimulus package. It may not be that big. Honestly, I wish it would be. I think we could get a lot of things done and get the country pointed in the right direction. I mean, if we can overcome the pandemic, if we can get people back to work, then we will be in a position that tax revenues will rise, and a prudent government could use some of that money to start buying back the debt and putting it to bed. So it's not impossible for us to get through that. Once again, you just need the votes. So I've explained to people over the last several years, it doesn't matter how brilliant your idea is. If you don't have the votes, it's not going to happen. So, yes, Dave.
Question for you. Yeah.
Sure.
The scare we had with the mob is an extension of what we probably has been seen quietly at local political meetings when some of these, I got a telephone call coming in, some of these people come in to disrupt the political meetings by a congressman that Trump unleashes.
Yes,
So
yes, yes.
He basically forced many Republicans to kowtow to his line of thinking, I thought. Now, I'm not aware at all, but the analogy with the brown shirts of Nazis was just terrible.
Yes, yes, yes. I agree. And for better or for worse, at that moment, clearly, the president finally went too far. But yes, honestly, way back in 2016, before the election, and I was teaching a political theory class, and a bright group of students there, but I showed them a film about Mussolini and I said, who does that remind you of? And they all said Trump. And this was before he'd even got the nomination. So indeed, fascist tactics were being employed there. And, as many people, Republicans and Democrats have now said, hey, wait a minute. No, we have elections and we have a peaceful transfer of power, and we always have. Now, clearly, all kinds of mistakes regarding security in the Capitol were made. I think there's no shortage of blame to go around there. And Suzanne has a question that is related to this. Should we still fear uprisings? I don't know. There aren't really that many of them, and although many of them are heavily armed.
Doesn't take many.
Yeah, it doesn't take many, but I think it was good that there was high security for the inauguration. I think that was the right thing to do. That sort of sends a message. I was reading a story about QAnon today. And if you're not familiar, QAnon is this lunatic fringe theory group that is convinced that there is a group of deep state people who are running a child sex ring for profit, and it's buried deep within the government. And their hope was, of course, that President Trump was going to root out all this evil and get rid of it. And they've been kicked off of social media platforms, and some of them are in despair, and some of them are saying, "Oh no, maybe Biden's the guy who's going to fix this," and others of them think that 3 days later, Trump will rise from the grave. I saw a thing the other day that said that, in fact, the real inauguration will take place March 4th, when Trump will assume his second term. So they're living in a really strange fantasy land. And this is sort of the gift of the internet, is that all these folks could effectively assemble in one place and share their theories. And I feel sorry for them, because I don't know why you would want this to consume your life. There
I
must
feel
be
sorry for us.
well, us too. Yeah, I know. But I mean, one of the things that I have tried to do since early in the Trump administration is sort of not blame, and I'm not suggesting anything about anything anybody else is saying, but for me, try to understand where folks are coming from, because people can learn. And if there is some way to reach out to folks like that and say, this isn't actually true. I mean, and I don't know exactly how that's going to happen, but yeah, it's a problem, and hopefully in a Biden administration, law enforcement will be sort of unleashed and will in fact take these kinds of things seriously. There was a tendency to kind of say, oh, they're just some cranky people. Well, they're cranky people with guns who are apparently not all the way afraid to use them. So that's serious.
Well, the evangelicals were also had other imagined things.
Yes, yes, indeed. And a number of them, I guess, have finally said enough. Maybe this guy isn't the second coming. So,
I better send a note to my hometown. Everybody's on the other side.
all right. Well, I hate to say this. I have a meeting at school I have to go to at 4.
What's the meeting?
It's about my job. My job's not in jeopardy. I just have to do this, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we get every 5 years you get post tenure review, and I have to write a report about what I've been doing that's right and what I'm going to fix, and they will come and observe my classes, and I'm close to retiring, so I'm not sweating this a whole bunch, but in any case, I have.
You want us to come and protest out front?
That's right. Yes, yes. And bring weapons too, right? It'll be assault. There's nobody there to protest for, but since we're all virtual. But anyway, thank you so much, folks. We will
Thank
talk
you.
next time about the Electoral College and see what the prospects are for doing something about that. And hopefully you'll find that interesting. I'm so glad to be with you all again. See you all here. Do be well and stay safe out there, and enjoy the next month till I see you again. So thanks,
Thanks.
everybody.
Thank you,
Take
Tim.
care.